Understanding a little bit about anatomy and joint positions can make a huge difference in your personal yoga practice, as well as in your teaching if you're a yoga teacher. Let's look at the different movements you have available to you at the hip joint. Abduction of the hip, adduction of the hip flexion, hip extension. This can also be done with the knee bend, hip flexion with knee flexion, and then hip extension with knee flexion. We also have hip internal rotation and hip external rotation. Hip internal rotation, if we do it with both legs, will tend to affect the pelvic position, dropping the pubic bone and lengthening the front of the spine. Whereas a little bit of hip external rotation, or simply engaging the buttocks, can have the opposite effect of dropping the tailbone in the back and lifting the pubic bone. This is called the posterior tilt, or tipping your pelvis back, whereas that inward rotation movement of dropping the pubic bone is part of the anterior tilt of the pelvis, or tipping the pelvis forward. Some people sit way too much, and then they do sports that involve flexing the hip and sitting way too much. So, for example, cycling or spinning classes, if that's all you do. You get really good at sitting, and then you exercise in sitting. So this can have the effect of creating really tight hip flexors, and basically keep the pelvis locked in this position where the hamstrings are lengthened. And then when you go to fold forward, you feel a stretch in your hamstrings right away because they're already in a lengthened position. And so for these people with too much of a good thing, it's actually key to introduce a little bit of posterior tilt, very subtle. So I'm not talking about going all the way and trying to fold, because that would round your back a little bit too much, and if you tried to pick something up, you could hurt yourself. But getting a little bit out of this extreme. Different muscles we can use to do that include the hip extensors, which include the glutes, the buttocks, as well as the hamstrings. We also have 4 sets of abdominal muscles: obliques, which cross the midline and relate to twisting or side bending; the six-pack, which lifts the pubic bone and pulls the front ribs down; and then your transverse abdominis, which is like a giant corset that can be used in a variety of different ways, but its fibers are more horizontal. And so all of these things are important. If someone is feeling really tight as soon as they fold, you can bet that they need to do some glute strengthening, as well as some strength on their abdominal muscles. And so that person who's feeling that stretch right away, if they keep looking for that stretch all the time, it might not actually fix anything. Stretching isn't always the answer. The answer might be strengthening the connections that get them out of this forward tilt lock position. So one great exercise is learning how to squat correctly, probably having the arms forward to help adjust the pelvic position, and then using the buttocks to come up. Other good exercise include core strengthening exercises, like going from a lengthened belly to gradually shortening the front line. Not quite a sit-up, more of this kind of movement. And the progression of that would be leaning back just enough that the hip flexors don't go crazy, and then lifting the legs up into boat pose, Navasana. And then crossing the legs, curling into a ball, and then repeating the posture. Crossing the legs, eventually introduce lifting. And do that about 4 or 5 times. That's a more advanced approach, but simply learning how to roll up and down with core awareness is a very good exercise to focus on. There are different ways someone's hips can be tight. Another common pattern is the person who stands around with their feet turned out and has their shoulders rounded forward, upper cross syndrome. So this person will also generally experience lower back pain when they start going forward and back, because the lower back is the only thing that's moving. It's a naturally flexible part of the spine that's prone to being hurt. When a person in this kind of position just walks down the street to go somewhere, instead of using their hip flexor muscles to flex their hip, they're often using their inner thigh muscles to drag the leg forward. And so as you can imagine, being turned out like that, it tends to drop the tail down a little bit too much, and then the inner thigh muscles are doing the work, so they get a little bit tight. So stretching the inner thighs can be really helpful, but it's also really important to focus on strengthening the movement of hip adduction, squeezing the midline. And it's amazing how weak these connections often are. So we internally rotate, and then we adduct, instead of simply externally rotating and using the adductors in a strange way all the time. So partly for that reason, yoga is often taught with an emphasis on internal rotation of the legs. But it's like a game of broken telephone where any action can be taken too far if the context isn't understood. So we internally rotate to find neutral, but not to go pigeon-toed. Find neutral. And this allows you to get more free movement of the pelvis so that you could either do a back bend at will or a forward bend without feeling any stress in the joints. If you watch someone who stands with their feet turned out most of the time do a forward fold, what you'll probably see is that their spine rounds right away, and they get stuck with their hands like on their lap or maybe on their knees. So no amount of adjusting them or pushing on their back is going to help anything. The pelvis hasn't been able to move. The pelvis needs to rotate around the femurs. So focus on internal rotation and simpler movements. Instead of folding forward and reaching for the floor, well, which would probably round the back in that kind of person, let's fold forward and reach for the wall, practicing wall dog. So this allows someone to get the spine pretty straight, get flexion in the hip joint, and even straighten the legs out. To teach such a person seated forward folds that involve straightening one of the legs, lengthening the hamstrings, probably wouldn't have the intended effect. You can almost guarantee it wouldn't. So let's look at a sitting position. Say something really simple like Paschimottanasana, both legs out in front. If a stiff person is even to sit up straight, they'd have to drop the pubic bone and lift the heart. And then the legs can rotate in a little bit, just to neutral. So just trying to get the legs straight from there would probably be a really big stretch for that type of person. So a tight person sitting has a few options. We can bend the knees and get them to drag their hands back to lift the heart. So the focus is on getting the back straight first. And this might still create a bit of stretch in the back of the legs or be incredibly difficult. This is a great place to work. Another nice approach involves also elevating the pelvis on some kind of prop, be it a few yoga blocks. I have this nice little pluff at home. It's nice to sit on for having snacks. So you can put something underneath the pelvis. We want to make sure that we're not sort of perching forward and rounding. We're still trying to lift the heart. And the advantage of having the pelvis raised is that you can straighten the leg to get hamstring length without requiring as much hip flexion. So this could be a really big stretch as well for somebody who's quite tight. If you just imagine them lifting the arms up, this is like their downward dog. So they're going to have their feet really far away from their hands to get their legs straight, which might not even be possible for them in downward dog. But that's also going to take a lot more work to hold. So in their downward dog, if they were to bend the knees, notice how that could bring the feet closer to the hands and allow them to work more. Another nice approach that you can add on to this posture is looping a strap around the feet. We can also combine these approaches. So bend the knees to get the back straight, sit up on a pluff, and then loop a strap around the balls of your feet, holding one end in each hand. And we want a long enough strap that the shoulders aren't forced forward right away. For a lot of people, if the shoulders go forward, they'll lose the upright posture. So we think about slightly retracting the shoulder blades, the scapula, and then pulling back a little bit. See how much you can straighten the legs. And this will probably be a really good stretch for someone who's tight, as well as an opportunity to strengthen the upper back. We can also try to tear the mat apart with the feet to engage hip abductors, which can help recruit the forward tilt of the pelvis and pull back. So it's like I'm trying to tear the strap apart, pressing my legs out to the sides while keeping inward rotation. And this is probably a really good stretch for somebody. Much better than if they just sat on the floor using a strap with their back rounded and started pulling on it, which is just going to round their back. Get the back straight, elevate the pelvis as much as necessary, and work the pulling muscles of the shoulder while trying to straighten the legs.